What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the BLU F91 5G. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. With the BLU F91 5G, we're getting a 6.8-inch LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 396, and an aspect ratio of 20.5:9. So both of these phones do have pretty good displays, but in general, the BLU F91 5G has a bit of an advantage here. First of all, the BLU F91 5G is significantly larger, and that tends to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with a 1080p resolution, you're going to get a sharper and more crisp image, whereas with the Moto G 5G, although it doesn't really look bad per se, with only a 720p resolution, if you're doing something like watching videos, playing games, or even just looking at photos, a 720p resolution is just not going to look nearly as good as 1080p. Another thing to keep in mind is that with the BLU F91 5G, with an aspect ratio of 20.5:9 versus 20:9, the BLU F91 5G has a slightly taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like streaming a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something vertical, like reading an article or using social media, with a taller and more narrow form factor, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. But on the other hand, with the Moto G 5G, again, this display really is not bad either. And one advantage the Moto G 5G has is the refresh rate. With a 90Hz refresh rate versus a standard 60Hz, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother with the Moto G 5G. So if you're doing something with motion on the screen, like watching a video, for example, things are going to look a little bit more fluid and premium with the Moto G 5G. But that being said, this is more of a subtle difference. So overall, while again, the Moto G 5G is really not bad, I do think in general, the BLU F91 5G does have a better display here. Now, as far as storage goes, with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. And with the BLU F91 5G, we're getting 128GB with microSD card expansion as well. Now, honestly, I do think both of these phones do have a pretty good amount of storage. I mean, even with 128GB, for most people, that is going to be perfectly fine, especially when considering the microSD card expansion, because even if you have a bunch of photos and videos and stuff like that, you can get even more space by offloading that kind of stuff onto a microSD card. But that being said, if you are more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, the Moto G 5G, of course, with double the storage of the BLU F91 5G, will have a significant advantage. But again, for most people, I do think either of these phones will be perfectly fine when it comes to storage. Now for security features, both of these phones have fingerprint scanners, and they're located in the exact same spot right here on the power keys. Definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner, and they both have face unlock as well. But starting with the Moto G 5G, let's go ahead and give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. Moving on to the BLU F91 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, no issues whatsoever. And again, remember, both phones also have face unlock as well, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Moto G 5G, we got a nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the BLU F91 5G, we got pretty much the same design for the front facing camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. For video, the Moto G 5G has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, and the BLU F91 5G has a max recording quality of 2K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. So overall, I wouldn't say either phone has a bad camera setup, but in terms of both features and quality, I would say the BLU F91 5G does have a significant advantage. First of all, the BLU F91 5G has an ultra-wide camera, whereas the Moto G 5G doesn't. And this is definitely a great advantage when you're taking a lot of photos. And the BLU F91 5G can also record in 2K, whereas the Moto G 5G can only record in 1080p. Now this one is a little less important in my opinion, because I don't really feel like 2K is that useful. For most people, if you're recording a lot of videos and you want a higher resolution than 1080p, you might as well just get a device that can record in 4K instead. But still, in general, it is nice that the BLU F91 5G can record in at least a little bit of a higher resolution. And again, in terms of quality, I would say the BLU F91 F91 5G in general is a little bit better. If you're more of a light user and you just want a couple nice Instagram photos, for example, the Moto G 5G will still get the job done. But again, between the two, if you're really using your camera a lot and you want the best quality, I would say the BLU F91 5G will have the overall advantage. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. With the BLU F91 5G, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810. Now, ran Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and the Moto G 5G came back with a single core score of 545 and a multi-core score of 1684, and the BLU F91 5G came back with a single core score of 576 and a multi-core score of 1692. So as you can see from this test, they are pretty close, and in general from my experience, you're really not going to see a significant performance difference between these two. But that being said, both phones are pretty fast for what they are. Sure, they're not going to be nearly as fast as a flagship phone, for example, but for being more affordable mid-range phones, for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and the occasional light mobile gaming, they will definitely get the job done. As far as the battery goes, both phones do have 5000 mAh batteries, with the Moto G 5G supporting 10W fast charging and the BLU F91 5G supporting 18W fast charging. So as far as the actual battery life and longevity goes, they are going to be pretty much the same, since again, both of them do have 5000 mAh batteries. But as far as charging features go, I will say the BLU F91 5G does have a significant advantage here. The first part of it is 18W fast charging versus 10W fast charging. While not being the biggest difference in the world, it's still going to be fairly noticeable, and if your fast charger is 18 watts or higher, again, you will see at least somewhat of a difference. In addition to this, the BLU F91 5G does support 10W wireless charging, so if you do like to use wireless charging, definitely keep this in mind as well. But all that being said, in general, I do think both of these phones do have really good batteries, so if having great battery life and longevity on your phone is important to you, you really won't go wrong with either of them. Another thing to keep in mind here is that with the Moto G 5G, we're not getting NFC with this phone, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, unfortunately you won't be able to do that. But on the other hand, the BLU F91 5G does have NFC, so again, if you do like to use tap and pay, you will be able to do this with the BLU F91 5G, but not the Moto G 5G, so definitely keep this in mind as well. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in almost every way, I do think the BLU F91 5G is the better device here. While the Moto G 5G is pretty close as far as performance and battery go, the BLU F91 5G has a better display with a larger size, taller and more narrow form factor, and a 1080p resolution versus only 720p with the Moto G 5G, which is going to be a lot better for content consumption. The BLU F91 5G also has a much better camera with an ultra-wide camera, whereas the Moto G 5G doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, and it has NFC, slightly better fast charging, and it supports wireless charging, whereas the Moto G 5G doesn't. But that being said, the Moto G 5G is not a bad phone at all. Again, the battery and performance are pretty much the same, and the Moto G 5G has double the storage, so if you're a power user and you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, then in that case, the Moto G 5G will have a huge advantage there. But at the end of the day, despite their differences, I do think both phones are great devices that provide quite a bit of value for the money. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the BLU F91 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalupa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.